Sarah worked double shifts at a small diner, barely making enough to cover her rent and support her young daughter. Every Thursday morning, she noticed an elderly veteran who would carefully count his coins before ordering the cheapest meal on the menu. His weathered hands and tired eyes told a story of struggle without telling anyone. Sarah began paying for his meals from her own tips, even on days when her own wallet was nearly empty. She watched quietly as his face lit up each time the cashier told him his meal was already covered. 3 months passed this way until one rainy morning when two well-dressed strangers walked into the diner. They sat in her section, watching her every move. Sarah had no idea this ordinary shift would change her life forever. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mythos Weaver. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. Sarah pulled her worn jacket closer as she walked through the early morning chill toward Riley's diner. The small restaurant sat on the corner of Oak and Main, its windows already glowing warmly against the dark sky. It was 5:30 a.m., and she needed to prep everything before the morning rush began. Inside, she tied her apron and started the coffee makers. The familiar scent of coffee beans filled the air as she wiped down tables and arranged menus. Her manager, Mike, counted the register drawer while telling her about the previous night's shift. Sarah checked her phone quickly. Her babysitter had sent a message confirming she could watch Emma, Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, for the extra hours this week. The extra shift meant more tips, and Sarah needed every dollar she could get. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 6 a.m. Sarah looked up to see Mr. James, the elderly veteran who came in every Thursday morning. His blue jacket had seen better days, but it was always clean and pressed. He walked with a slight limp, using a simple wooden cane for support. Mr. James sat in his usual booth by the window. Sarah noticed how he pulled out a small notebook where he kept track of his expenses. His Social Security checks didn't stretch far, something Sarah had overheard him mention to another regular customer once. She approached his table with a warm smile. "Good morning. Would you like your usual coffee to start?" The old veteran nodded, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Sarah saw him counting coins under the table, trying to be discreet. That morning, watching him calculate his limited budget, Sarah made a decision. When he wasn't looking, she slipped the cashier $12 of her own tip money. "His breakfast is covered," she whispered to Jenny at the register. "Just tell him it's been taken care of." The genuine surprise and gratitude in Mr. James's eyes when Jenny told him the meal was paid for made Sarah's heart warm. Even though her tip money would be short that day, she didn't know then that this small act of kindness would be the first of many or how it would eventually lead to something extraordinary. Every Thursday morning became the same routine. Sarah would set aside a portion of her Tuesday and Wednesday tips to cover Mr. James's breakfast. Some weeks were harder than others, especially when customers were sparse or when Emma needed new school supplies. One particularly cold morning, Sarah noticed Mr. James coughing more than usual. His hands shook slightly as he held his coffee cup. She brought him an extra cup of hot water with lemon and honey from the kitchen. "Oh, this might help with the cough," she said softly. Mr. James looked up at her with grateful eyes. "You remind me of my late wife, Margaret. She always knew how to take care of everyone." He pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. The image showed a younger Mr. James in his military uniform, standing next to a woman with a gentle smile. As they talked, Mr. James shared more of his story. After returning from Vietnam, he and Margaret had run a small bookstore for 30 years. When Margaret got sick, the medical bills forced them to sell the store. After she passed away 5 years ago, his son David had offered him a place in Boston, where David ran his own bookstore business. "David's a good son," Mr. James said quietly. "He handles my rent, medical bills, everything major. But this place, this community, it's been my home for 40 years. I told him I wanted to stay independent and manage my own daily expenses with my pension. He respects that, even though I know he worries." Sarah understood the pride in Mr. James's voice. Like many people his age, he valued his independence. She kept quietly covering his breakfast, never mentioning it, understanding that sometimes help means letting people keep their dignity. Other servers at the diner noticed Sarah's weekly routine. Jenny, the cashier, once offered to split the cost of his meal, but Sarah politely declined. "I can manage," she said. "Besides, my daughter Emma is learning about veterans at school." When I tell her about helping Mr. James, her face lights up. One Thursday, Mr. James didn't show up at his usual time. Sarah kept glancing at the door, worried about his absence. Then, she noticed the back closet door standing open. She overheard another regular customer mention that the Veterans Housing Complex was undergoing some renovations, making it difficult for elderly residents to get around. That evening, while counting her tips and planning next week's budget, Sarah had no idea that Mr. James's absence was about to set in motion a series of events that would change everything. The following Thursday, Sarah was wiping down tables when she noticed two well-dressed people enter the diner, a man and woman in their 40s. They carried themselves with a professional air but seemed slightly out of place in the modest establishment. They chose a booth in Sarah's section. As she approached their table, the woman smiled warmly. "Are you Sarah?" she asked. Sarah nodded, wondering how they knew her name. The man introduced himself as David James and the woman as Lisa James. "We're Mr. James's son and daughter-in-law. We're here checking on Dad during the building renovations. Dad's staying with his neighbor for a few weeks while the elevator's being fixed," Lisa explained. "When we offered to move him temporarily to Boston, he insisted on staying local. That's when he started telling us about this diner and particularly about you." David pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a small notebook. It was Mr. James's expense diary. Every Thursday for the past 3 months, there had been an entry, "Breakfast paid for by Angel." The old veteran had known all along that someone was covering his meals, David said softly. "Dad's always been proud, independent. When Mom passed, he let me handle the big expenses, but he was determined to manage his daily life on his own. We respected that, but we worried." Then his recent letters started mentioning this kind waitress who seemed to understand him better than anyone. One tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as she felt the weight of the kindness shared between them all. It was nothing special, just a few dollars each week. Lisa reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "It wasn't about the money," she said. "Dad told us how you listened to his stories, remembered how he liked his coffee, noticed when he wasn't feeling well. You treated him with dignity. We live in Boston now," David continued. "I run a small but successful bookstore chain, much like the one Dad and Mom used to have. When Dad told us about you, about your kindness, we decided to drive down and meet you ourselves." Sarah listened as they spoke, unaware that this conversation would lead to an opportunity that would transform her and Emma's lives. The simple act of helping Mr. James was about to come full circle in ways she never expected. David and Lisa spent the next hour talking with Sarah during her break. They learned about her daily routine, working double shifts while raising Emma alone. Sarah shared how she'd been taking online business classes in the evenings, dreaming of someday managing her own small business. "What kind of business would you like to run?" Lisa asked, stirring her coffee. Sarah's eyes lit up as she described her idea for a small bookstore cafe. "Something like your parents' old store," she said to David. "Mr. James told me how it was more than just a bookstore. It was a place where people felt welcomed, where stories were shared." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly how Mom and Dad ran their store. When they had to sell it for Mom's medical bills, it broke their hearts. I started my own bookstore chain, trying to recreate that same feeling but on a larger scale." He paused, exchanging a look with Lisa. "We'd been planning to open a new location in this area, close to Dad. Something smaller, more personal than our other stores. Actually," Lisa added, "we were hoping it might convince Dad to let us help more, having a family business nearby. But we need someone who understands both books and people, someone who knows this community." Sarah listened as David explained their idea. It would involve managing the store's daily operations, organizing community events, and creating the warm atmosphere his parents' store was known for. The salary was more than double what she made at the diner, with health benefits that would cover Emma's medical expenses. "We've been interviewing candidates for weeks," Lisa said. "But meeting you, hearing about your business classes, and seeing how you treat people, especially Dad, that's exactly what we're looking for." Sarah felt overwhelmed. "But I don't have any formal business experience," she said quietly. David shook his head. "You've shown more business sense and people skills than many qualified candidates. The way you've managed your tight budget, worked extra hours, and still found ways to help others, that says more than any resume." They arranged to meet again the following week for a formal interview. As David and Lisa prepared to leave, Lisa handed Sarah a business card. "We'd like to help you transition. Take some time to think about it. We can work around your schedule for training." That evening, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, looking at the business card while Emma did her homework. The possibility of a better life seemed within reach, all because she'd chosen to help someone in need. 3 months later, Sarah stood behind the counter of the newly opened Cornerstone Books and Cafe. The store honored the legacy of Mr. James's old family bookstore while adding modern touches. Natural light streamed through large windows, illuminating comfortable reading chairs and well-organized bookshelves. The transition hadn't been easy. Sarah spent 6 weeks training with Lisa, learning the bookstore's management system while still working part-time at the diner. Emma's babysitter agreed to extra hours, and Sarah's manager at Riley's Diner gave her a flexible schedule during the transition. Mr. James had become the store's unofficial greeter. After David and Lisa opened the store near his apartment complex, he finally accepted their offer of a part-time role, sharing his decades of book-selling experience. 3 mornings a week, he helped customers find books and shared stories about his old store. Having a place to contribute made him feel purposeful again, and Sarah noticed how he stood taller and smiled more often. "It's different than accepting charity," he told Sarah one quiet afternoon. "Here, I'm giving something back. And watching you run this place reminds me so much of how Margaret and I started." Sarah's daughter, Emma, would come to the store after school, doing her homework at a small table near the children's section. The stable work hours meant Sarah could help with her schoolwork and even attend parent-teacher meetings without worrying about missing shifts. The store quickly became a community gathering spot. Sarah implemented a pay-it-forward program, allowing customers to buy coffee or books for others who couldn't afford them, an idea inspired by how she used to help Mr. James. Local teachers started bringing their classes for reading sessions, and elderly residents found a welcoming place to spend their mornings. David and Lisa's trust in Sarah proved well placed. The store's sales exceeded their initial projections, but more importantly, it had become exactly what everyone had hoped for, a bridge between generations, connecting Mr. James's past with Sarah's future. One evening, as Sarah was closing up, Mr. James and David sat together in the reading corner. "You know," Mr. James said, his eyes misty, "I was so stubborn about keeping my independence that I almost missed seeing this place come to life. Sometimes, accepting help opens doors for everyone." That night, as Sarah locked up the store, she remembered those mornings at the diner, counting tips to cover Mr. James's breakfast. A small act of kindness had grown into something she never could have imagined, changing not just her life, but touching her entire community. Somewhere, she thought, Margaret must be smiling down at her, her family's legacy living on in such an unexpected way. Love this story? Tap that like button and subscribe to Mythos Weaver for more. Let us know how this story made you feel with a single word in the comments.